a quiet corner of the world, far away from bustling cities and noisy streets, a group of elders had gathered. They were not just any elders. They carried the weight of centuries of knowledge and the burden of knowing things most humans could not even imagine. Their faces were lined with time, their eyes deep with understanding. Every wrinkle told a story, every glance carried a warning. The elders had met in a hidden chamber, a place carved into the heart of an ancient mountain. It was a sacred space, filled with the smell of old wood and burning herbs, and the walls were etched with symbols that spoke of wisdom far beyond ordinary understanding. They had convened because the signs were clear. Something was stirring in the world, something dangerous, something powerful. For generations, they had watched humanity grow, learn, and struggle. They had seen incredible progress, but they had also seen how fragile humans could be. They had learned that when humans gained something too quickly, power, knowledge, or strength, they often could not control it. History had shown again and again that when humans ignored caution, chaos followed. As the elders settled into their seats, their voices, calm but serious, filled the chamber. "The time is approaching," one said, his voice steady like a mountain stream. "Humanity is on the verge of awakening. We cannot ignore it any longer." Another elder shook their head. "We have warned them before. They have forgotten the lessons of the past. They are not ready for what is coming. If we push them further, if we allow the wrong knowledge to fall into their hands, the consequences will be catastrophic." The room fell silent for a moment. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees as if the world itself was listening. Every elder knew the weight of this moment. They had debated this before countless times, yet this time it felt different. The signs were too strong, the warnings too clear. Humanity was about to cross a line it had never crossed before. But as always, there were disagreements. One figure, younger than most but ambitious and restless, leaned forward, their eyes shining with determination. "We cannot hold them back forever," they said. "Humans are strong, clever, and adaptable. Perhaps it is time they learn for themselves. Perhaps it is time we give them a chance to grow, even if it is risky." The other elders exchanged worried glances. This had always been the problem. There were always a few who underestimated the danger, who believed that humans could handle anything if only given the opportunity. But the elders knew better. Power without understanding, knowledge without caution. It was a combination that had led to disasters countless times before. One of the oldest elders, their voice trembling slightly with age but carrying an authority that could not be ignored, spoke clearly. "We have seen what happens when humans reach beyond their limits. They do not understand the forces they awaken. Their curiosity is both a gift and a curse. We must not ignore this warning. Whatever is coming, we must guide it carefully, or it will destroy more than just themselves. It will destroy everything around them." The ambitious figure frowned, but they did not speak. Deep down they felt a twinge of doubt, but they pushed it aside. They had always believed that humans were capable of more than anyone had given them credit for. They had always believed that progress, even dangerous progress, was worth the risk. The elders continued their discussion, weighing the options, debating the possibilities, and considering the dangers. They spoke of patterns they had seen before, of events in distant times that had shaken the world, and of the tiny signs that often went unnoticed until it was too late. Every story they told was a lesson, every memory a warning. And yet, despite all the wisdom in the room, the ambitious figure could not help but think of the possibilities. They imagined humans rising to new heights, discovering abilities and knowledge that had been hidden for centuries. They imagined a world transformed, stronger and smarter than ever before. The thought was intoxicating, almost impossible to resist. Finally, after hours of debate, the meeting came to a close. The elders gave their final warning, their voices heavy with gravity. "Do not awaken humanity," they said. "Some forces are not meant for them. Some knowledge is too dangerous. Do not be tempted. Do not be careless. Remember, even the smallest mistake can have consequences that last generations." The ambitious figure listened quietly, nodding politely, but inside, their mind was already elsewhere. They had heard the warnings, yes, but they had also made their decision. They would act. They would take the risk. They would awaken humanity, even if the elders had said otherwise. As the elders left the chamber one by one, leaving the ambitious figure alone, the air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that was difficult to describe. It was as if the very walls of the chamber were aware of the decision that had been made, as if the mountain itself was warning of what was to come. The ambitious figure stayed behind, staring at the symbols on the wall, tracing their fingers over the carvings. They thought of the humans who would soon experience this awakening. Some would thrive, some would struggle, some might even fail entirely, and yet the figure believed that it was worth it. They believed in humanity, or at least in the potential they could unlock. Outside the chamber, the world continued as usual. People went about their lives, unaware of the forces at play, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Children laughed and played, merchants traded goods in busy markets, and the wind carried the scent of the coming storm across the land. No one could see what was about to happen, and no one was prepared for the awakening that was already beginning in secret. The ambitious figure left the mountain that night, moving quietly through the forests and valleys, making plans and gathering resources. They had already begun to reach out, contacting select individuals who could help them in their work. These were not ordinary people. They were curious, intelligent, and willing to take risks. They would be the first to experience the awakening, the first to touch the power that had been hidden for so long. And as they moved through the darkness, the elders watched from afar, their faces somber. They could not stop what was coming, but they could prepare for it. They could guide those who were willing to listen, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could limit the damage. But deep down, they knew that once humanity was awakened, nothing would ever be the same again. The night passed slowly. Stars glittered in the sky like distant eyes, watching silently over the land. The ambitious figure worked tirelessly, driven by vision and curiosity. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the world, the first subtle signs of awakening began to appear, small sparks of change that no one noticed, but that would grow into something unstoppable. By morning, the elders had returned to their homes, their hearts heavy with worry. They had warned the ambitious figure, they had pleaded for caution, and they had reminded them of the dangers. But the decision had been made. The course was set, and the world was about to enter a new era, an era that no one could predict, an era that would test humanity in ways no one had imagined. And so, the story began. Humanity, unaware and unprepared, was about to awaken. The ambitious figure had set the wheels in motion, and the elders could only hope that when the time came, humans would find a way to survive the power they were about to receive. It was the beginning of a journey that would change everything. The elders' warnings had been ignored. A choice had been made, and the world would never be the same again.
After the ambitious figure left the elders' chamber, the world outside continued as if nothing had changed. People laughed, argued, worked, and lived their daily lives, completely unaware that a hidden force was beginning to stir. At first, the changes were invisible, subtle, almost imperceptible. But beneath the surface, the ambitious figure's work had already begun. They moved carefully, reaching out to select individuals who were curious, intelligent, and open-minded. These people were not ordinary. They had always felt out of place, as if the world held something more for them, something they could not yet understand. The ambitious figure sought them out, not to control them, but to awaken a potential they believed was buried deep within humanity. The first steps were simple experiments, small tests to see what humans could achieve if given a glimpse of what was possible. Some individuals were shown ways to improve memory, enhance focus, or solve complex problems faster than anyone thought possible. Others were encouraged to trust their instincts, to listen to parts of themselves they had always ignored. The ambitious figure watched closely, recording every reaction, every subtle sign of growth. At first, the results were mild, almost invisible. A student suddenly understood a difficult concept without explanation. A worker solved a problem that had stumped an entire team. A musician composed melodies that seemed beyond their skill. These were small sparks, tiny ripples that hinted at something much larger beneath the surface. The ambitious figure felt a thrill of excitement. The warnings of the elders were still in the back of their mind, but they were pushed aside by the possibility of what could be achieved. Humanity was capable of more than anyone had imagined, and these early successes seemed proof of that. But the changes did not stop with simple improvements. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, humans began to act in ways that startled those around them. They noticed patterns others could not see, made connections that seemed impossible, and solved problems with creativity that defied logic. People who had never been considered extraordinary suddenly began to shine. Communities began to take notice. Teachers whispered about students who learned faster than ever. Leaders wondered why certain workers could innovate in ways no one expected. Scientists scratched their heads at discoveries that seemed to come from nowhere. And all the while, the ambitious figure continued their work in secret, guiding the awakening carefully, making sure it spread without causing immediate chaos. Even so, not everything went as planned. The ambitious figure began to notice signs of strain. Some humans were overwhelmed by the new abilities, confused by the sudden clarity or heightened perception. Emotions ran stronger, thoughts became louder, and some individuals struggled to control what was happening within them. A few became reckless, taking risks without understanding the consequences. This was the first real warning. The ambitious figure realized that awakening humanity was not as simple as they had imagined. The elders had been right. Some humans were not ready. And yet, the potential was too great to ignore. They adjusted their methods, offering guidance to those struggling, teaching balance, and trying to minimize harm. But the ripple effect could not be contained. As humans began to show these small, unusual abilities, others started noticing. Rumors spread quickly, stories of people with unusual insight, rapid learning, or extraordinary intuition. Communities were curious, fascinated, and in some cases, fearful. Humans were beginning to question what they knew about themselves and the world around them. The ambitious figure had expected this. They knew that humanity would not remain hidden forever. The goal was not to keep the awakening secret, but to guide it carefully, to help people learn to control their new abilities. But even with careful planning, human nature had its own momentum. Curiosity turned to experimentation turned to discovery, and discovery led to challenges that no one could have predicted. Some individuals embraced their new potential with joy and curiosity. They explored their abilities, learned new skills, and began to help others in ways that were unprecedented. Communities thrived as these people shared knowledge, healed the sick, or solved problems that had persisted for decades. For a moment, it seemed as though the ambitious figure's vision might succeed without disaster, but not everyone used their awakening wisely. A few exploited the changes for personal gain. They manipulated others, sought power, or acted recklessly, causing conflicts that escalated quickly. Tensions grew in towns and cities as humans struggled to understand what was happening. Laws and systems that had once maintained order began to falter, unable to cope with the rapid pace of change. The ambitious figure watched closely, torn between excitement and concern. They had expected challenges, but the speed and intensity were surprising. Humanity's awakening was not just a simple expansion of ability, it was a transformation of perception, emotion, and behavior. The world itself was beginning to feel different. Meanwhile, the elders observed silently from afar. Though they had been ignored, their instincts were never wrong. They saw the first signs of imbalance, the early fractures in society caused by sudden awakening. They knew that if the ambitious figure continued without restraint, the consequences could be far-reaching. Yet for now, they could do little more than watch, hoping that guidance could reach those who needed it. Back in the hidden places where the ambitious figure worked, meetings were held with those who had shown potential. They were taught to control their abilities, to think carefully, and to help others. The ambitious figure emphasized responsibility, warning them of the dangers of misusing power. But even with training, the temptation to push boundaries was strong. Humans, after all, were curious by nature. One by one, the individuals began to demonstrate abilities that no one had anticipated. Some could solve extremely complex problems in minutes. Others could sense dangers or detect truths that were hidden from ordinary perception. A few could influence small events with precision and subtlety, changing outcomes in ways that seemed almost magical. The ambitious figure realized that humanity had surpassed expectations. The spark they had ignited was growing into a blaze, spreading faster than anyone could control. And yet, even with this success, unease settled in their chest. The elders' warnings echoed in their mind. Power without wisdom is dangerous. Knowledge without caution is catastrophic. As the world outside continued its normal rhythm, subtle cracks began to appear. Communities argued over the ethical use of new abilities. Leaders struggled to maintain control. Ordinary people were confused, afraid, or in awe of those who had awakened. Society was being reshaped, not by governments or institutions, but by individuals who were learning to harness powers that had been hidden for centuries. The ambitious figure felt both pride and fear. They had created something extraordinary, something that could change the course of humanity forever. But they had also unleashed something unpredictable, something that could not easily be undone. Every success carried a shadow of risk, every advance a hidden cost, and yet there was no turning back. The awakening was already underway. Humans were changing, evolving, growing into something new. The ambitious figure continued their work, reaching out to those ready to learn, guiding them as best as possible, and trying to prevent disaster. But the world had already shifted. The first signs of the awakening were becoming impossible to ignore. Ordinary people began noticing extraordinary changes in themselves and others. Communities whispered about sudden insights, rapid learning, and abilities that seemed impossible. The ambitious figure knew that the moment of full awakening was approaching, and with it, the moment of reckoning. By the end of this period, humanity had already stepped onto a new path. The ambitious figure had begun what the elders had warned against, and the consequences were starting to ripple through society. Some humans embraced the changes, some struggled with them, and some sought to exploit them. The world was no longer the same, and there was no way to return to the way things had been. In the quiet moments, the ambitious figure paused to reflect. They had set in motion a force greater than themselves, a force that could bring incredible progress or devastating chaos. They understood the risks, but the vision of humanity's potential kept them moving forward. And somewhere in the distance, the elders watched, knowing that the choices made now would echo for generations to come. The awakening had begun, subtle and quiet at first, but unstoppable. Humanity was no longer unaware, no longer ordinary. And as the ambitious figure prepared for the next stage, they knew that the true challenges, the true test of humanity, were only just beginning. The awakening that had begun in secret was no longer subtle. It had grown beyond the careful control of the ambitious figure. What started as small sparks in a few humans now spread like wildfire. People who had once been ordinary began to show abilities that amazed and frightened those around them. They could solve problems in seconds that had baffled entire groups for years. They could sense danger before it arrived, notice truths that others overlooked, and see patterns in the world that were invisible to most. At first, many tried to hide these abilities. People were afraid of being different, afraid of what others might think or do if they knew. But hiding such change was difficult. Even small actions betrayed the new strength, speed, or intelligence. Friends began to notice, coworkers whispered, and families grew cautious and curious. The world was changing, whether humanity wanted it or not. The ambitious figure watched these developments with a mixture of pride and unease. Their plan had succeeded beyond expectation, but they had underestimated the speed at which humans would adapt. The elders' warnings echoed in their mind. When humans awaken, the results are unpredictable. Curiosity and emotion could amplify abilities in ways no one could control. And now, the ambitious figure was seeing the first signs of that truth. Some humans used their newfound powers wisely. They helped communities solve long-standing problems, created solutions for poverty, disease, and environmental challenges, and taught others to develop their abilities responsibly. They became beacons of hope, admired by those around them. Entire towns began to flourish in ways never seen before. But not all humans were careful. Some were overwhelmed by the intensity of what was happening inside them. Emotions became stronger, thoughts raced faster, and self-control became a challenge. A few people acted recklessly, testing limits without thought of consequences. Others used their abilities to manipulate, control, or take advantage of those less awakened. Where there was light, darkness always found a way to appear. The ambitious figure realized that awakening humanity was far more complex than they had imagined. Power was not neutral. It amplified who a person already was. Those who were compassionate became healers and innovators. Those who were selfish or reckless became sources of conflict and chaos. And the balance of the world was beginning to shift. In some cities, rapid changes caused tension between those awakened and those still ordinary. Governments, unprepared for the transformation, struggled to maintain order. Laws could not keep up with sudden abilities, and institutions that had once been stable now faltered. Communities argued over ethics, responsibility, and control. People feared what they did not understand, and fear often bred conflict. Amid this growing chaos, the ambitious figure sought to guide those who were ready to learn. Secret gatherings were held in hidden places, forests, mountains, abandoned buildings, where awakened humans could meet, practice, and receive guidance. They were taught to control their abilities, understand their limits, and use their new powers responsibly. The ambitious figure emphasized patience, compassion, and balance. They knew that without careful training, humanity's awakening could spiral into disaster. Even with guidance, the changes were not easy. Many humans struggled to adapt. Some could no longer relate to those who were ordinary. Some felt isolated, misunderstood, or burdened by abilities they did not yet fully understand. Others became frustrated with the limits imposed on them, longing to explore the extent of their new potential. The ambitious figure worked tirelessly to support them, but the scale of change was enormous. Meanwhile, the elders observed from afar, their concern growing with each passing day. They had warned that awakening humanity was dangerous, and now their fears were coming true. They had anticipated chaos, but the speed and scale of change were staggering. The ambitious figure had acted without restraint, and the consequences were beginning to ripple across society. As humans' abilities grew, so did their awareness. People began to question the world in ways they never had before. They saw corruption, inequality, and injustice with new clarity. They challenged authority, questioned traditions, and demanded change. Some used their powers to enforce fairness and justice, while others sought to dominate or disrupt. Society itself became a living experiment, shaped by the awakened individuals who now influenced everything around them. In small towns, the awakening brought both wonder and fear. Farmers suddenly predicted weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. Teachers guided students in ways that accelerated learning beyond imagination. Doctors discovered cures for illnesses that had long plagued humanity. These advances brought hope, but they also sparked envy, fear, and resentment among those who felt left behind. In larger cities, the effects were more chaotic. Traffic systems, economies, and public services struggled to adapt. People with heightened perception noticed flaws in structures, systems, and leadership, sometimes correcting them, sometimes causing panic. Those with new mental acuity spotted corruption and dishonesty, often exposing it publicly, which led to unrest. Society's balance was being tested in real time. Through it all, the ambitious figure remained at the center, guiding, teaching, and observing. They were proud of the potential they had unlocked, but fear lingered. Humans were powerful now, but power without wisdom was dangerous. The ambitious figure remembered the elders' words. Some forces are not meant for them. Some knowledge is too dangerous. And yet, humanity had already crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. Even as they worked to prevent disaster, they could not control every outcome. A young thinker, once quiet and unnoticed, now predicted outcomes in complex systems that baffled even experts. A musician's compositions could influence the emotions of entire crowds. A healer could sense illnesses before symptoms appeared. Each new ability, each new awakening, added layers of complexity to the world, and each had the potential for both good and harm. The ambitious figure realized that humanity was not just growing in skill, they were evolving in awareness, perception, and emotion. The awakening was not simply about abilities. It was about seeing the world differently, understanding connections, and challenging limitations. Humans were no longer ordinary. They were extraordinary, and the world was adjusting to the new reality. Yet, with every triumph came tension. Some people resented the awakened, fearing change, power, or disruption to their lives. Others sought to exploit abilities for personal gain, creating conflict and division. Communities debated ethics, morality, and responsibility as never before. Human society, once stable in its routines, now felt unpredictable, fragile, and alive with new energy. Despite the challenges, there were moments of awe and wonder. Ordinary humans watched in amazement as small acts of extraordinary skill transformed lives. A farmer's insight saved a harvest. A child's intuitive knowledge prevented an accident. A healer's sudden awareness cured a long-standing illness. These moments inspired hope and belief in humanity's potential. The ambitious figure, exhausted but determined, continued to guide the awakening. They knew that the most difficult work was still ahead. Humans had been awakened, but the true test had only begun. Could humanity use these abilities wisely, or would the temptation of power lead to destruction? Could balance, compassion, and responsibility survive in a world suddenly filled with extraordinary potential? The elders, watching from afar, remained vigilant. They had been ignored once, but they would not turn away now. They prepared to step in when necessary, to guide, to advise, and if needed, to intervene. They knew that humanity's journey had only just begun, and the choices made in this period would echo for generations. By the end of this phase, the world had changed irrevocably. Humans were no longer limited by their former abilities or understanding. The ambitious figure had succeeded in awakening humanity, but the consequences were both exhilarating and frightening. Ordinary life had been disrupted, society had been challenged, and human potential had been unleashed in ways that could not be contained. And as the ambitious figure looked out over the world, they understood the reality of what had been done. Humanity had awakened. Some would rise, some would fall, and some would struggle to find their place in a world that no longer followed the old rules. The elders' warnings had come true, but so had the promise of extraordinary human potential. The awakening had moved from subtle sparks to undeniable transformation. Humanity was learning, adapting, and evolving at an unprecedented pace. And the ambitious figure knew that the most important lessons were yet to be taught, lessons about wisdom, responsibility, and the true cost of power. The world was no longer the same. The first phase of awakening was complete, and the stage was set for the next chapter, where humanity would face the consequences of their new abilities, and where the true challenge of controlling, balancing, and understanding this power would begin.
The world had changed in ways that no one could have imagined. What had begun as small sparks of awakening had grown into a full blaze, touching nearly every corner of human life. Humanity's abilities were no longer secret. Ordinary people, once unaware of what was possible, now observed the extraordinary talents of their neighbors, co-workers, and even strangers. The air seemed charged with a strange energy, as if the planet itself had shifted in response to the awakening. At first, there was fascination and excitement. People marveled at the new possibilities, celebrating those who could do things once thought impossible. Communities felt alive with potential, and progress accelerated at an astonishing pace. Problems that had seemed unsolvable were suddenly addressed. Cities experimented with new ideas, technology advanced faster than ever, and human understanding grew in ways that seemed almost miraculous. But alongside the wonder, a shadow began to spread. The more humans awakened, the more complex and unpredictable the world became. Some people misused their abilities, either out of selfishness or because they could not yet control the power within them. Arguments and conflicts escalated faster than before, fueled by abilities that allowed people to influence, manipulate, or outthink others in ways previously unimaginable. Governments struggled to maintain order. Institutions that had once guided society efficiently found themselves overwhelmed by the rapid pace of change. Rules, regulations, and laws seemed insufficient when people could foresee consequences, detect dishonesty, or solve problems instantly. Many leaders felt powerless, unsure how to respond to this new reality. In some cases, authorities attempted to suppress the awakening, but such efforts were futile. The human spirit, once awakened, could not be contained by rules or force alone. Tensions began to rise between those who had fully embraced their new abilities and those who had not. Some humans felt left behind, powerless and afraid, while others struggled to accept that the world had changed so dramatically. Communities began to fracture as people chose sides, those who embraced the awakened and those who resisted. Trust, which had been a foundation of society, began to erode under the weight of fear and misunderstanding. Even in the midst of this chaos, the ambitious figure continued their work. They reached out to those willing to learn, helping them control and refine their abilities. Secret schools, hidden workshops, and underground gatherings became places of guidance, where humans could practice and grow responsibly. But the scale of change was immense. For every person guided, there were countless others who were left to navigate their awakening alone, and not all were prepared to handle it. Some humans became leaders, using their abilities to organize communities, solve local problems, and inspire others. They became symbols of hope, demonstrating what humanity could achieve when guided by wisdom and compassion. These individuals were celebrated, their efforts widely admired. But their influence also drew resentment. Others feared the concentration of power, worried that the awakened would dominate or exploit the less powerful. In cities, the differences became even more visible. Some neighborhoods thrived as awakened humans brought innovation, efficiency, and care to every aspect of life. Streets became safer, services improved, and communities flourished. Meanwhile, other areas suffered. Misuse of abilities, conflicts, and misunderstanding led to disruption and unrest. People who had been cautious or unaware struggled to adapt, feeling powerless in the face of the sweeping changes. The ambitious figure realized that awakening humanity was no longer a matter of potential alone. It was now about responsibility, ethics, and control. Every action had consequences. Every choice mattered. A single reckless decision could ripple through society, causing chaos that might take years to repair. And yet, despite the risks, the awakening could not be reversed. Humanity had stepped onto a new path, and the consequences would unfold naturally. The elders watched from a distance, their concern deepening. They had warned that humanity's awakening would bring both wonder and danger, and now their fears were materializing. They observed the fractures forming across communities, the conflicts escalating, and the misuse of power spreading. They knew that intervention might be necessary, but they also understood that humans had to learn to balance their own abilities. Direct control was impossible without creating resentment or rebellion. In small towns, the consequences were easier to manage but no less serious. Farmers with enhanced perception grew crops efficiently, but disputes arose over who could access resources first. Teachers with extraordinary insight advanced students quickly, yet ordinary children sometimes felt left behind or ignored. Even acts of kindness caused friction, as some humans resented the influence and impact of the awakened. Every action carried both progress and tension. In larger cities, the consequences were more dramatic. People with heightened abilities began to change systems at a pace that overwhelmed institutions. Financial markets shifted unpredictably. Public services struggled to meet new demands, and infrastructure strained under the rapid innovation introduced by those awakened. Ordinary citizens watched in awe and fear, unsure how to navigate a world where people could see, think, and act far beyond what they had ever known. Amid the chaos, conflicts began to flare. Some humans used their abilities to manipulate situations for personal gain, creating rivalries and disputes. Neighborhoods clashed over resources, businesses competed unfairly, and governments struggled to keep the peace. It became clear that awakening humans had created a new form of society, one that was extraordinary, unpredictable, and fragile. The ambitious figure, aware of the growing unrest, tried to intervene where possible. They gathered those who showed promise in leadership, teaching them not just how to use abilities, but how to inspire, guide, and balance power responsibly. They emphasized empathy, patience, and foresight, knowing that the survival of society depended on more than just individual talent. Humans had to learn cooperation, understanding, and restraint. Even with guidance, not all could be saved from mistakes. Some humans, overwhelmed by power, acted recklessly, unintentionally causing accidents, misunderstandings, and disputes. Others deliberately used their abilities to gain advantage or settle old grievances. Conflict, once contained by social norms and laws, now had a force multiplier, abilities that amplified both intention and effect. In the midst of this turmoil, humanity's creativity soared. Artists, musicians, inventors, and thinkers who had awakened began to produce work that inspired entire communities. Buildings were designed with new efficiency, technology advanced at an unprecedented rate, and communication became more intuitive. Yet the price of these wonders was a society on edge, brimming with potential but teetering on the brink of instability. The ambitious figure realized that the awakening was a double-edged sword. Humans were evolving in remarkable ways, but the rapid pace of change made mistakes inevitable. Every step forward carried risk. Every benefit was mirrored by a potential cost. Humanity's journey was no longer just about discovery. It was about survival, adaptation, and learning to live with the consequences of newfound power. Meanwhile, the elders continued to watch carefully. They remained largely in the shadows, only occasionally intervening when the balance of society was at risk. They offered guidance to those willing to listen, helping them understand that wisdom and patience were just as important as ability. For those who ignored advice, however, the elders could only hope that lessons learned the hard way would not destroy everything humanity had achieved. As the months passed, the consequences became even more apparent. Some regions experienced rapid improvement in quality of life, safety, and innovation. Others fell into conflict and disorder, as individuals struggled to control abilities or exploit them against others. Inequality grew, not because of wealth alone, but because of differences in awakening, understanding, and responsibility. Humanity had been changed forever, and the world was adjusting to a new reality that no one could have predicted. Amid this uncertainty, the ambitious figure reflected on their decision. They had wanted to unlock humanity's potential, to show what was possible when curiosity and courage were allowed to flourish. And in many ways they had succeeded. Humans had risen beyond previous limits, discovering new skills, insights, and ways of thinking. Yet the price had been higher than they anticipated. Conflict, fear, and instability were now part of everyday life, and no single person could fix it alone. The ambitious figure continued to guide, teach, and protect where they could. But they understood the truth. Humanity had to learn to navigate this world on its own. The elders had been right. Awakening humans was dangerous, but it had also been inevitable. The spark had been lit, and there was no way to extinguish it. The only hope was to help humanity find balance, wisdom, and responsibility before the consequences grew too great. By the end of this stage, it was clear that the world had been transformed. Society was no longer predictable. Communities were fractured, cities were alive with both hope and tension, and humans were no longer ordinary. Every individual, whether awakened or not, was now part of a new reality, one in which extraordinary potential coexisted with extraordinary risk. The ambitious figure knew the hardest work was still ahead. Humanity had been awake. The world had reached a tipping point. Humanity, once ordinary and predictable, was now extraordinary and unpredictable. The awakening had spread across cities, towns, and villages. People who had once lived simple lives were now capable of astonishing feats, some helpful, some harmful, and some beyond comprehension. The ambitious figure watched with a heavy heart, knowing that their decision had changed the course of history forever. For many, the initial excitement of awakening had worn off, replaced by confusion, fear, or frustration. The abilities that once seemed like gifts now came with responsibility, expectation, and sometimes isolation. Humans began to feel the weight of their own power, and not all were ready for it. Mistakes became more frequent, tensions rose, and the cracks in society deepened. The ambitious figure tried to guide those willing to listen. They gathered the awakened, teaching them how to control their abilities, act responsibly, and consider the consequences of their actions. Secret meetings became more important than ever. Humans who had learned early how to balance power with wisdom now became mentors, helping others navigate the rapid changes in the world. But no matter how much guidance was given, the challenge was immense. The scale of the awakening had grown far beyond what one person could manage. In many places, the consequences were already unavoidable. Communities fractured as humans struggled with jealousy, competition, and misunderstandings. Families found themselves divided, with some members awakening faster than others. Friendships were tested, businesses faced internal conflicts, and governments were forced to adapt or collapse. The awakening had created a society where extraordinary abilities could easily outshine laws, traditions, and expectations, leaving chaos in their wake. Some humans used their abilities to help others. They healed, taught, and built communities that thrived despite the unrest around them. They became pillars of hope, proving that humanity's potential could be extraordinary when paired with wisdom. These humans worked tirelessly, using their skills to calm disputes, solve problems, and inspire cooperation. They showed the world that progress was possible, even in a time of uncertainty. But there were others who misused their gifts. Some acted recklessly, seeking advantage, revenge, or recognition. Conflicts escalated quickly, as abilities amplified both action and consequence. Arguments that would have been minor before now became full-scale disputes, with individuals capable of influencing events far beyond their immediate surroundings. Cities and towns felt the strain, and ordinary citizens who were unawakened struggled to keep pace. The ambitious figure realized that humanity had reached a critical stage. The initial spark of awakening had grown into a fire, and now it threatened to consume everything if left unchecked. They understood that humans had to face the consequences of their actions, both to learn responsibility and to find balance. The elders' warnings had been accurate. Power without wisdom is dangerous, and knowledge without restraint can be catastrophic. In some regions, chaos became visible. Entire neighborhoods were disrupted as individuals competed for influence and control. Resources were redirected based on intuition or insight, sometimes helping and sometimes harming others. Cities that had once functioned smoothly now experienced unpredictable changes in leadership, commerce, and social dynamics. People began to question not only their neighbors but the very systems that had governed them for generations. At the same time, hope persisted. Communities that embraced cooperation and responsibility flourished. Humans who had learned to balance their abilities with empathy became beacons for others. They mediated disputes, resolved crises, and taught new generations how to use their gifts wisely. In these areas, the awakening became a force for progress and innovation, rather than chaos. People began to understand that power alone was not enough. It had to be guided by purpose, morality, and compassion. Despite these successes, the ambitious figure knew that failure was still possible. Humans were not inherently perfect, and not all would embrace responsibility. Mistakes could undo the progress that had been made, and the consequences of misuse could ripple across entire regions. The ambitious figure worked tirelessly, visiting communities, training mentors, and providing guidance wherever possible. But no matter how much effort they put in, they could not control everything. The awakening was too widespread, too powerful, and too human. Meanwhile, the elders remained vigilant. They had warned of this reckoning, and now it had arrived. They watched closely, stepping in only when necessary to prevent disaster. Their presence was subtle, offering guidance, wisdom, and support to those willing to receive it. They knew that humans had to experience the consequences of their own choices to truly learn. But they also understood that unchecked chaos could threaten the very survival of society. In this stage of reckoning, humans began to understand the true nature of their awakening. They realized that their abilities were not just gifts but responsibilities. Every action had weight, every choice mattered, and every mistake could have far-reaching effects. Some struggled under this realization, feeling overwhelmed or burdened. Others embraced it, learning to act thoughtfully, carefully, and with consideration for the world around them. The ambitious figure observed these changes closely. They had ignited the spark, and now it was burning brightly in humanity. They saw humans rising to challenges, finding solutions, and creating opportunities that had been impossible before. But they also saw conflict, fear, and division. The world had become a testing ground, and humans were learning, sometimes painfully, what it meant to live with extraordinary potential. In some places, humans began to form alliances, communities of the awakened working together to create balance and stability. They shared knowledge, trained others, and mediated disputes. These communities became models for others, demonstrating that power could be used responsibly and ethically. Yet the ambitious figure knew that these examples were fragile. One reckless action, one misuse of power, could unravel months or years of progress. Across the world, humans faced their first major challenges as a species transformed by awakening. Conflicts that had once been minor now had extraordinary consequences. Natural disasters, political unrest, and societal pressures were magnified by the abilities of the awakened. Humans had to learn quickly how to manage both their personal growth and the impact they had on the world. Failure to do so could lead to widespread chaos. Through all of this, the ambitious figure remained committed to guiding humanity. They understood that the path forward would not be easy. Humans had to face the consequences of their actions to truly learn responsibility. They had to balance ambition with empathy, curiosity with caution, and power with wisdom. The world had changed forever, and the stakes had never been higher. In quiet moments, the ambitious figure reflected on the journey so far. They thought of the elders, their warnings, and the decision that had set humanity on this path. They understood that awakening humans was both a gift and a challenge. They also realized that the hardest lessons were yet to come. Humanity had been transformed, but now it was time to see whether they could survive the reckoning they had brought upon themselves. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the world would never return to its old ways. Humans had been awakened, and the consequences were now visible everywhere. Some had thrived, some had struggled, and some had faltered entirely. Communities had been tested, societies challenged, and the very nature of human interaction reshaped. The ambitious figure knew that the true test was not over. Humanity had been given extraordinary potential, but it was now up to each individual to use it wisely. The reckoning had begun, and the choices made in this stage would shape the future for generations to come. The balance between progress and chaos, hope and fear, power and responsibility was delicate, and humanity's survival depended on getting it right. And so, the world waited, uncertain, but alive. Humans faced the consequences of awakening, learning the weight of their abilities and the responsibility that came with them. The ambitious figure watched, guiding when possible, hoping that the lessons of this reckoning would teach humanity not just to grow, but to live wisely with the extraordinary power they had been given.
Humanity had survived the reckoning. The world had been transformed in ways that were unimaginable just months before. What had begun as a subtle awakening had grown into a full transformation, touching every aspect of life. People who had once been ordinary were now capable of remarkable feats. Some had learned to control their abilities with care, while others still struggled with the weight of power. But the world had moved forward and humans had adapted. The ambitious figure watched quietly from a distance. They had guided, taught, and protected, but they understood that the final phase was no longer about instruction. It was about observation. Humanity had reached a stage where it could shape its own future. Some individuals had become leaders, teaching others how to use abilities responsibly. Others had learned to balance personal power with empathy and morality. Slowly, patterns of stability and wisdom were emerging from the chaos, yet even in this new world, challenges remained. Humans were still learning the limits of their abilities and the responsibilities that came with them. Conflicts occasionally flared, misunderstandings still arose, and mistakes were made. But unlike before, humans were beginning to handle these challenges with awareness and cooperation. Lessons were being learned, and experience was turning into wisdom. Communities had begun to organize around shared values. Humans who had awakened worked together, guiding those who were still discovering their potential. Knowledge was shared openly, mistakes were analyzed constructively, and innovation flourished. These communities became examples of what humanity could achieve when power was balanced with responsibility. They built infrastructure, created solutions for social and environmental problems, and taught others to thrive in the new reality. Education transformed completely. Schools no longer relied solely on memorization or routine. Instead, humans taught each other how to think critically, understand complex systems, and manage abilities responsibly. Lessons about ethics, cooperation, and empathy were just as important as lessons in skill and knowledge. Children were guided carefully, learning not only how to develop their potential, but how to live responsibly in a world filled with extraordinary power. Even governments, once overwhelmed and fractured, began to adapt. New structures emerged, designed to accommodate humans with heightened abilities while protecting those who were unawakened. Laws became more flexible, systems more inclusive, and leadership more aware of the balance required to maintain stability. Cooperation between communities became more common, and conflicts were increasingly resolved through dialogue and mediation rather than force. The ambitious figure noticed a change not just in society, but in the individuals themselves. People had become more thoughtful, more aware of the consequences of their actions. Many had discovered that true strength did not lie in raw ability alone, but in patience, understanding, and the wisdom to guide others. Humans were learning that power was a tool, not a goal, and that responsibility was just as important as talent. Across the world, humans reflected on the journey they had taken. They remembered the fear, the chaos, and the mistakes. They remembered the moments of failure and frustration, but they also remembered the triumphs, the breakthroughs, and the acts of kindness and cooperation that had emerged from the struggle. Humanity had changed, but the lessons learned ensured that this change would endure. The ambitious figure felt a quiet satisfaction. The elders' warnings had been serious, and the risks had been real. Humanity could have destroyed itself in the reckoning, but instead, people had found balance. They had faced the consequences of awakening and emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable than ever before. The ambitious figure realized that their decision, while risky, had ultimately given humanity a chance to rise beyond its previous limits. The elders, who had watched the entire process, acknowledged the transformation with quiet respect. They had feared the worst, yet they saw the potential fulfilled. Humans had learned to navigate power responsibly, to work together, and to build communities capable of handling extraordinary change. While there was still work to be done, the lessons of the past and the guidance provided during the reckoning had ensured that humanity would not repeat the mistakes of history. Humans themselves began to reflect on the true meaning of the awakening. They realized that extraordinary abilities were not the end goal. They were tools to create a better world. Power without purpose could destroy, but power with wisdom could uplift. The mistakes made during the reckoning had taught humility, patience, and understanding. Humans learned to value cooperation over competition, insight over impulsiveness, and responsibility over pride. New generations grew up in this transformed world, guided by mentors who had survived the awakening and learned from its challenges. These children were taught not only to develop their abilities, but to understand their purpose. They learned history, ethics, and the importance of empathy. They saw firsthand the consequences of misuse and the rewards of responsible action. They were growing into a humanity that was stronger, wiser, and more capable than any before. Technology and society advanced at an unprecedented pace, guided by humans who had awakened. Solutions to old problems, hunger, disease, environmental decay, were no longer distant dreams. Humans worked together across communities and nations, applying their enhanced understanding to solve issues that had once seemed impossible. The world was becoming more efficient, more balanced, and more harmonious, not through force, but through intelligence, cooperation, and shared purpose. Even conflict had changed. While disagreements and mistakes still occurred, humans learned to resolve them with thoughtfulness and dialogue. Violence decreased as the value of cooperation became clear. Communities developed systems to anticipate problems, mediate disputes, and guide individuals in managing their abilities responsibly. Mistakes became opportunities for learning rather than sources of destruction. The ambitious figure observed all of this quietly, knowing that their work was complete. Their role had been to awaken humanity and guide it through the initial challenges. The future was now in the hands of those who had learned, those who had adapted, and those who had chosen responsibility over recklessness. Humanity was no longer dependent on a single guide. It had grown capable of shaping its own destiny. In the quiet moments, the ambitious figure reflected on the journey. They remembered the elders' warnings, the secret beginnings of awakening, the excitement and fear of discovery, and the chaos of reckoning. They remembered humans faltering, learning, and finally rising to meet the challenge. It had been a long, difficult journey, but the result was a world transformed and a humanity stronger, wiser and capable of more than ever before. And yet, the ambitious figure understood that growth never truly ends. Humanity would continue to face challenges, make mistakes, and learn new lessons. Power would always carry responsibility, and knowledge would always demand wisdom. But the awakening had given humans the tools to navigate these challenges successfully, and the lessons learned during the reckoning had prepared them for the future. The elders, who had once warned against awakening humanity, now acknowledged the balance achieved. They saw that humans had learned to grow not just in ability, but in understanding, compassion, and wisdom. The world was no longer ordinary, but it was capable of extraordinary things, and humans had the choice to ensure that the potential was used for good. As the ambitious figure looked out over the world, they saw humans creating, building, teaching, and learning. Communities were thriving, knowledge was spreading. Individuals were growing into their full potential while respecting the balance required to maintain harmony. The reckoning had passed, but its lessons endured, shaping every action, decision, and interaction. The world had changed, but it had survived. Humanity had grown stronger, wiser, and more aware. The awakening was complete, not just as a transformation of abilities, but as a transformation of thought, responsibility, and perspective. Humans had faced the consequences of power and learned to rise above them. They were no longer ordinary, but they had become capable of extraordinary things with care, compassion, and wisdom. And so, the story of awakening came to its conclusion. Humanity had been tested, challenged, and transformed. The ambitious figure had guided the process, the elders had watched and offered subtle guidance, and humans themselves had learned the lessons that could only come through experience. The world was not perfect, and challenges would continue, but humanity was ready. The awakening had taught one enduring truth. Power is meaningless without wisdom. Ability is useless without responsibility, and knowledge can only create progress when guided by purpose. Humans had learned this lesson, and the future, though uncertain, was filled with possibility, hope, and potential unlike anything the world had ever seen before. And in this new world, humanity stood on the threshold of its own destiny, ready to build, create, and thrive, not just as individuals, but as a species capable of greatness, tempered by understanding and guided by the lessons of the past. The awakening was complete and the legacy would endure.